Thank you so much for coming. My name is Geena Rocero. I am the founder of Gender Proud. But let me start by saying that I am a very proud woman of transgender experience. I am an immigrant, I'm a daughter, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm many of those things. And the reason why I'm saying that is because we need to look at things through this intersectionality lens, that I'm not just this one person. I am all parts of that. And in a way, that's how I navigate my life, right? And my journey really starts from the Philippines. This little alley is where I grew up in Guadalupe in Makati. Our house is actually like right there on top. This little alley was a place where I first realized who I am. The place where I discovered that my gender assignment at birth was different than what I was assigned. I remember at such a young age, my point of reference in my gender and expression was different the way people would look at me. So this little neighborhood where people know each other, it's a very intimate setting where you could smell the chicken adobo next door and you could just walk into someone's house. Everybody knew each other. However, in our neighborhood, I remember at such a young age, walking around our neighborhood, going to home, to school, every time I would run into these tuk-tuk tricycle drivers, the men would somehow feel entitled to scream a homophobic slur to me, this word called bakla. So at such a young age, you're just going to school, this is what you encounter. At a certain point, as a young person, you go through this thing and you internalize this fear. And little did I know, it's something that I would carry with me for a long time. As a young person, being told that I'm not who I am, it's a country that is also very traditionally Catholic. I remember some of the first times people would tell me, Jesus created you a boy, be a boy. But I knew deep inside the person that I am. I remember one of the first moments where I would always wear the t-shirt on my head or the towel and I would walk around our house. And my mom asked me, why do you always wear that t-shirt in your head? I said, Mom, this is my hair. I'm a girl. Literally, my self-identification was from the bath towel. So I think for many people who don't understand what young trans youth go through, transgender youth know who they are. It is our role to support them and encourage them to be who they are. Philippines is a country that is very traditional Catholic, but the big irony is this. We have this culture of transgender beauty pageants that happens during the religious celebration. Talking about irony, right? So little did I know, at 15 years old, I was watching one of these transgender pageant in one of the fiesta celebration in our neighborhood. I was watching a pageant and this woman came up to me. She said, how come you're not joining this pageant? You know, as a young 15-year-old, being asked that question was a life-changing moment for me. This woman named Tiger Lily is basically my transgender mother. She gave me this opportunity for the first time to be who I am, to fully be who I am. So when she asked me that question, of course I joined the pageant. And that night, I won the pageant, best in swimsuit and best in long gown. From that moment on, my life changed, right? But for some people, they would see this because it's part of our culture. There's this big misunderstanding that people would say, you mean it's a part of a culture? You mean it's accepted? People understand it? It's far from it. And I would like to say that, you know, in the Philippines, there is a degree of trans and LGBT people are culturally visible, but not politically recognized. And then when I was moving to United States in San Francisco in 2001, it was almost the other way around. I remember one of the first phone calls that my mom told me that my green card petition came through that I could now move to the United States. Initially, I didn't want to move to the United States because, you know, I wanted to continue living that life as a diva, as a trans beauty pageant queen. I was having a good time. And some of my friends would tell me that in the United States, trans people are, you know, the way culturally and the visibility is not as much the way that we had it in the Philippines. In a way, it was the other way around. So when I moved to San Francisco in 2001, there was a degree of political recognition, meaning there are rights that allow me to change my name and gender marker. There's anti-discrimination policies. There are safe access for hormones for trans people in San Francisco. But there was no trans beauty pageant. So in a way, it was the other way around, right? And people would ask me, which one is better? Both are better. You know, I think this is why it's so critical that when we talk about policy, we also need to ensure to change the culture because there are people behind those statistics. We need to make sure that the culture reflect those policies. We're not just enacting policies of gender recognition law or anti-discrimination bill. We need to make sure that we're changing the culture or the way media presents trans people. So in 2005, I made the decision to live my dream and to move to New York City as a model. So I moved to New York City in 2005, not knowing anybody, and realizing that I really wanted to continue living my dream. But it's important to put a context here. In 2005, in New York, there was not an out trans-identified model. It was a different context. So I made the decision when I started modeling, I did not share that I was trans. Even my model agent did not know. And as much as I was living my dream, doing campaigns, being cover of magazines, I was living my dream. I was just that young trans girl in that little alley in the Philippines, and here I am living my dream. But at a certain point, after living this life for 10 years, I remember every time I would come home from a casting or a commercial shoot, I would come home feeling so afraid that what if somebody finds out? What is going to happen in my career? Because the women who came before me, they paved the way for me. The moment they came out as trans model, their careers were over. So it was a completely different context. But living this life definitely took an emotional toll on me. At a certain point, I understand the degree of privilege in living my dream, but internally, because the culture did not allow me to be visible as a proud trans woman, at a certain point, I've had enough. I couldn't continue living that life. So on my 30th birthday, I made the decision that if I'm going to risk my career that I built, I want it to mean something. I want it to be so big. And so I made the decision 3 years ago to share my story for the first time on the TED Talk, a talk that changed my life, a talk that's been viewed more than 3 million times, translated in 32 languages. Looking at this picture, I remember that those nerve-wracking moments of, for the first time, standing in front of so many people and say, this is me, I am a proud trans woman. I couldn't ask for a better reception. But one thing I told myself that if I'm going to do this, I didn't want it to just be about a TED Talk. I wanted to continue the conversation. So after this talk came out, I also launched an organization called Gender Proud, which is a global advocacy that advocates for global LGBT rights, transgender rights specifically. We work with big UN bodies, UNDP, State Department, making sure that there is a human face in those policies that they're trying to enact. We also have a production company where we produce stories about what it means to be trans. My life has changed. Been invited to speak at the White House, meeting the president. It's one of those moments you look at this, wow, this is the dream that I've always wanted to be. Part of our job was to go back to the culture where I grew up. So 2 years ago, I did a project back in the Philippines where I just wanted to give back to the culture that loved me and supported me. We went all the way to different cities in Cebu and Manila. This is in Vigan, which is a city way up north in the Philippines. And we work with local LGBT groups, even indigenous LGBT people. Some people traveled like 3 rivers and mountains just to get to this talk. It's important that we're not just talking about the urban environments and making sure they have access. People have access to information. One of the projects that we did is this web series called Beautiful As I Want to Be with Logo TV, where we literally simply asking transgender youth, how do you define beautiful as you want to be for you? Because for the longest time, they're not allowed to be themselves. We got nominated for a prestigious GLAAD Media Award, where we basically put a mentorship component with transgender youth. And this woman named Arley DJ was a writer in this Emmy Award-winning show called Transparent. Another project that we did is a web series with Fusion and Univision called Willing and Able. It's a series profiling lives of transgender people of color and their employment process in New York City. Again, making sure that we put a human face on those policies. In United States specifically, transgender people are twice likely to be unemployed. Most trans people of color specifically make less than $10,000 a year. And I think one of the most important things in this project is we highlight people's stories, not just the struggle, but also the perseverance. And I think as a storyteller myself, as a producer, it is so critical for me to highlight stories of the most marginalized people. Because when we do that, we get to deconstruct the institutional racism, sexism, transphobia that unfortunately leads to trans women of color with a life expectancy of 35 years old. can't live that life. Just recently, on the 50th anniversary of ASEAN, this is why this conversation has to continue. As a regional body, it's still so lagging in acknowledging transgender and LGBTI rights. In many countries, same-sex relationships are still criminalized. In Brunei, in Singapore, and Myanmar. My transgender brothers and sisters are criminalized in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. We need to do better. There's a very groundbreaking report that happened about 3 years ago in 2014. USAID and UCLA Williams Institute did this big study on the relationship on LGBT inclusion and the relationship in emerging markets. And it says that if you have LGBT rights for people in these countries, there's a big economic output. Like literally, there's a higher GDP per capita. LGBTI rights are an economic imperative. It's a moral responsibility for everybody to recognize the humanity and empowering people that are the most marginalized that unfortunately leads to a lot of violence and death in my community. I want to wrap this up by saying I think a big part of my work is about merging cultures and identity to the current environment. This is a picture of Ferdinand Magellan getting into the Philippines. And the reason why I'm saying this is because in the Philippines, in pre-colonized environments, transgender and gender non-conforming people are actually shamans and priests. We are actually celebrated. But colonization did a lot to introduce this notion called gender binary. In the Philippines, before Spain got to the Philippines in 1521, and we were a colony of Spain for close to 400 years, this picture right here is the image of the Babaylan. They were the gender fluid shamans and priests. They were the spiritual advisors to the kings and queens in the Philippines. On the other picture are the Bisu, the Indonesian shamans and priests that have long predated any new culture. And the environments that's happening right now, my trans brothers and sisters in Indonesia, we need to do something about that. I want to wrap this up with this image. This image is by a painter, a Filipino painter named Brian Barreto. This is a picture of me inspired by this mythical goddess in the Philippines called Lakapati. Lakapati is a transgender goddess of fertility and of golden rice. Trans people, gender non-conforming people, has always been here since the beginning of time. We've been around. And I think it's important, in a way, to talk about anthropology and to understand that people have always existed. This is nothing new. And once we merge those two cultures together, I think it would allow us for a better conversation about what it means to be an LGBTI person, especially LGBTI youth. Thank you so much for joining me here.
So do you find that I have a slight, I'm from the Philippines as well, I have a slight frustration about the way we talk or provide services to LGBTQ people in ASEAN, which is that while I think it's great to emphasize HIV prevention and safe sex, no one talks about financial literacy and access to basic services, which could be denied. There's no actual law that says you cannot deny a basic service to someone who is non-conforming, basically. And I think there are certain careers where it's quote-unquote okay to be LGBTQ plus, but such as you can be a hairstylist or a fashion designer. But I know a lot of dentists who are afraid to come out, right? I know a lot of doctors and because straight people might have issues about that. And are there things that straight allies can do to help the cause, basically?
Thank you for that question. I think, especially to the point what you said about the allies, I think we have to recognize degrees of privileges. People that have access to opportunities to give way to LGBT people, to mentor them in certain environments. There's been a big conversation in this very specific moment when we talk about we need to be inclusive with this technology and this is how we'll get better as a regional body. And that word inclusivity, we always need to challenge that word, right? What do you mean by inclusive? Does that include LGBTI people? Leading to economic empowerment. In the Philippines specifically, outsourcing business is a big part of it's a big economic output in our GDP. Globally, multinational corporations are usually the ones that are leading the way in supporting LGBTI rights. I think with the point where you're saying about are there more, it should be more opportunities. Of course, there should be more opportunities talking about not just HIV, not just the discrimination, the violence, and talking about how we would really empower our people, my community. There are certain places in the Philippines that I know of, certainly LGBT chambers of commerce, people that work at the outsourcing industries that have had that. I think there's a little bit of the imperative for global multinational corporations to adhere to the global policies when it comes to LGBTI rights. So I hope that answered your question.
I am Rob Head from Thomson Reuters. Next week we've got Idaho, our Ida Hobbit, the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia. I think what I find is that engaging with multinationals is quite straightforward in getting them engaged in supporting inclusion activities. But how would you, maybe next week when the message is on point during Idaho, engage with local employers where perhaps there's a lot more challenges in engaging LGBT plus employees?
I particularly like that question because in this current environment, especially, I mean, I'm also speaking specifically in United States where there's a big interest right now in conversation about trans visibility. And what sometimes happens is this thing called tokenizing, where let's just put one trans person speaking in an employment resource LGBT Idaho celebration. But what happens to those policies? That one picture that I showed when I did the campaign for Marriott hotels, when you think of Marriott as a brand, people think, oh, this very traditional company, but they were actually one of the first company that supported transgender healthcare inclusive in their healthcare policies and their employee. That's what we need to do, right? And I think when you partner with local organizations and activist community, when it comes to this big global celebration and making sure that there's a policy in place for global multinational corporations, you can't get away when people are. I think global multinational corporations can't get away when there's actual people on the ground knowing the struggles that they've gone through. They're going to call out those multinational corporations if it's some sort of tokenizing, and that's what we need to not have, which is this tokenizing aspect that put one person on the podium and we're good. That doesn't help anybody. That's not authentic. That doesn't lead anywhere. So engaging with local organizations that deals with those specific needs is critical. I hope that answered that.
Firstly, Geena, we need more of you. Yeah, many more. I think all will agree here. So thank you for inspiring us. Secondly, how do you see in the ASEAN region? I come from Indonesia, where we have, as you know, a lot of issues with this complexity that we've created. How do you see over the years in your journey coming back to the region? Are you seeing changes in other countries? You've talked about the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and how do you see that changing? And do you have hope?
I definitely have hope. You have to have hope. When you don't have hope, it's gone, right? We can't move forward. It's apathy, right? So I'm a very optimistic person. Knowing where I've come from, being able to achieve the dream that I've had, and making sure that I go back to those communities that loved me and supported me since the beginning. The context of very traditional religious context is a very sensitive subject for most people, but we need to move forward in that conversation. When you see data of the violence and the murders of LGBTI people, we need more data in a way to see more, for people to know more about what's truly happening on the ground. I think media has a big role to play in making sure that when they're interviewing a trans and LGBT person, that it's not from this very sensationalistic aspect of media coverage, that it's really a very dignified component. And that's why I started Gender Proud as a producer. Because for the longest time, trans people and gender nonconforming LGBT people are the subject of the stories, that we were not allowed to be the ones in control of our narrative. So culture and policy, those two things has a big relationship with each other. As I mentioned earlier, the culture component is the changing of hearts and minds. Media has a big role to play. So I hope that answered that.
So in which country do you think there will be the next transgender prime minister? And maybe also when, but I'm more interested in the country if I can pick one.
How about Philippines just elected our first openly transgender Congresswoman, Geraldine Roman? How's that for a start, right? And people would always think, it's a very traditional country, Philippines, the only country in the world where you can't get divorced, besides the Vatican. And then we have a first openly transgender Congresswoman, Geraldine Roman. So there is hope. There is possibility. We need to do better and hold people accountable, our government systems, and making sure the separation of church and state and policies that needs to be enacted to empower the LGBT community. So maybe it will be in the Philippines. I don't know. That really took me as a surprise, right? Having a first openly transgender Congresswoman. There are some countries like Argentina is one of the, in a way, in Argentina, a very traditional Catholic culture. It's actually one of the first country that enacted the most progressive gender recognition law, which means it allowed trans people to change name and gender marker on your legal documents. And people would say, why do we need that? It's as simple as being, you apply for a job, you present your identification, and it doesn't match who you are. What would be the HR person's first question? It's like that confusion between that. You can even get to the point of asking questions about your capabilities. So global policies are changing. Malta, a small country in Europe, it's a very traditional Catholic country, right? They swung on the other side, which is completely open and progressive in their transgender policies, even tackling the question of this thing called conversion therapy, which basically forces transgender and gender nonconforming youth, gay youth, to be straight. Pray the gay away type of component. So there are many policies that's happening. Certainly within the UN level, there's a lot of organizations like Outright International is one of the lead when it comes to global policies within the UN bodies. So things are happening. As I said, I am optimistic in making this happen. I'm standing here because so many people made it possible for me to be who I am. The activist community, even in the Philippines, have always been here, been fighting since the beginning of time with no resources. So there is definitely hope.
What's the one actionable thing each of us here can do, like a small thing that we can commit to that would help?
I would say there's definitely the notion of lack of resources for LGBT organizations. Start supporting through money. Support transgender-led organizations. Support LGBT organizations. Provide resources. It's as simple as that, allowing LGBT organizations to, in their capacity building, in their projects, but most importantly, talk to a person that you've not spoken with before. Have that human component, human contact, and get to know another person. In the US, for the longest time, not a lot of people knows about trans people, but media and media-facing, opportunities for trans people allows people to get to know us. We're just like anybody with our hopes and our dreams. When you get to know another person, how could you hate someone that you truly know?